Daniel Tokar here at the Willow Forge, and today's topic is a continuation of the Blacksmith's Dictionary, but rather than talking about tools, I'm going to talk about people and trades and how things have changed over time. I think what I'm going to do is just go through a list of job descriptions or names of things as they would have been in the 18th century. We had blacksmiths, farriers, whitesmiths, cutlers, armorers, gunsmiths, locksmiths, arrowsmiths, wheelwrights, wainwrights, millwrights, pudlers, colliers, foudrymen, coppersmiths, silversmiths, goldsmiths, and jewelers. And probably several hundred more, but these are the ones that most people will run into if they read histories or if they're interested in writing stories or having games or LARPing in the period. These are the typical sorts of trade names that you'll run into. And some of them make sense that are easy to figure out. I mean, coppersmiths, silversmiths, goldsmiths. Those are people who work with copper, silver, and gold with hammers. Jewelers tend to be people who set stones and make jewelry. Makes sense. Blacksmiths work with the black metal. They work with iron, which gets an iron coating, iron oxide coating, and that's why they're called blacksmiths, because it's the black metal. Whitesmiths are whitesmiths because they would file or grind off the black oxide coating on forged work and make bright and shiny things like kitchen equipment, smoking utensils, lots of small personal articles. So if you see something that is a shiny, polished, forged iron thing, say from the 18th century, the forged part was probably done by a blacksmith or another specialized trade and finished by a whitesmith. Cutlers also make sense. They made cutlery, meaning knives, cutting tools, wood chisels, anything that had a working edge was a cutler. Even though blacksmiths did make knives and woodworking tools and other things, the cutler was the specialist. They were a little better at making the edged weapons and tools. But they didn't call them bladesmiths back then. You did hear the term swordsmith used occasionally, but cutler was the more normal 18th century term for somebody who made sharp things. An armourer, by that time, didn't make armor anymore. There wasn't much call for armor. They tended to be people who worked at arsenals, maintaining or repairing things like cannons, muskets, pistols, rifles, other equipment like caissons and other field gear. That would have been an armorer's work. Gunsmiths did forge out parts for guns. But even by the 18th century, a lot of them had specialized so that some people were making barrels, some people were making locks, some people were casting the brass parts, and some people were working with the stocks and the wood. So even in the 18th century, it wasn't that common to see a rifle or a shotgun or a pistol that was entirely made in one shop. A lot of that stuff would have been an effort between several shops. Locksmiths. There were people who actually forged out locks, and it was a specialized trade because it took a lot of skill to make a lock that worked with a key and wouldn't open to other keys. Modern locksmiths don't forge things out, but they do have to be licensed and very skillful to be able to fix and repair locks. Same thing with gunsmiths. Modern gunsmith actually has to be licensed to work on modern weapons, though very few of them actually forge things. You have some people who make period weapons who aren't technically a gunsmith from the licensing viewpoint, because the modern world, it's weapons that use cartridges and fixed ammunition that require a gunsmith. If you're making flintlock rifles, you can actually do that without being a gunsmith. It's a strange thing, how the words change over time. Arrowsmiths did forge out arrowheads. Wheelwrights were people who made wheels, so they made the iron tires and all of the hubs and things, and did a lot of precision woodworking to make a wheel. So they had to be fairly good metal workers as well as fairly good woodworkers to make good wheels, and that was a specialized trade. Wainwright was what they called somebody who made wagons, because a wagon was a wain. So if you know anybody who's a wainwright, that's a trade name. Their family back in the day probably built wagons. Millwright is the same sort of idea, except they did water-powered mills, mostly for grinding grain. Pretty much any trade that has right at the end of it were people who built things. A pudler was somebody who turned cast iron from a large furnace, cupola furnace, into wrought iron that could be hammered. They had to puddle it. A collier was somebody who made charcoal, which is a very specialized trade at the time that all the blacksmiths and foundry people needed for the fuel. A foudryman was somebody who cast things, typically cast iron, cook pots and things like that, but maybe cannons and other things. So all of these were specialized trades back in the day, but as the 19th century went along, you ended up having an awful lot of these trades shrink because we had factories that produced them. So locksmiths went out of the lock making business because there were factories that made locks a lot cheaper than a one or two man shop could make locks one at a time by hand. So the locksmiths didn't go out of business, they turned into key makers and people who maintained locks. Same thing with blacksmiths. The reason why people think that blacksmiths did things like shoe horses is because by World War I, when blacksmiths and horses were on their way out, blacksmiths had basically only shoeing and fixing wagons left. There weren't many blacksmiths that were making things like axes and farm implements. They generally weren't even repairing things like that by World War I. So this is why that image of the blacksmith shop having a horse being shod in it is so prevalent, because that was more toward the end of the traditional trade. You do still have coppersmiths, silversmiths, and goldsmiths in the world that are still hitting things with hammers. Armorers today really are making armor again. Even though in the military they do have armorers who are basically maintaining weapon systems. But in the civilian world, you do run into the occasional armorer who is still making armor. One of the big ones, I think, is cutler. Almost nobody calls themselves a cutler today. You run into knife makers and bladesmiths. And I think that's a pretty obvious division. The bladesmiths are the people who forge out blades and then finish them. The knife makers are people who generally grind out their blades. There's also divisions on both sides about people who do their own heat treating, because some knife makers who grind their blades do their own heat treating. And some bladesmiths that forge their blades don't do their own heat treating. So you can have somebody forging a knife and not doing heat treating, or they could forge the knife and do the heat treating. Same thing with people grinding blades. Some people send their blades out, some people do it in-house. So there's a lot of crossover and ambiguity about these things. I think the main thing to keep in mind is that the Americas, the modern American idea of all of these trades is a little more fluid than they were in Europe, because we never really had a guild system or a lot of regulation in this country early on to keep the divisions so narrow. In most European countries, you had to belong to a guild or were otherwise regulated by law as to what kind of a trade you could continue to do. In America, if you were trained as a blacksmith and you wanted to be a farrior, well, nobody was going to stop you from shoeing horses. If you were a locksmith and you wanted to become a gunsmith, nobody in America cared. They would have cared in Europe. You wouldn't have been able to do that in England or France back in the 18th century, at least not easily. You'd get into a lot of trouble with the law and the guilds that were around at the time. And this is sort of what has added to the confusion, because in America, we don't have the delineated traditions that they had in Europe, and a lot of the trade names just got all mixed up. And I don't know if I should get annoyed by people who don't seem to understand the difference, because it's easy to get them confused. If you're writing a historical novel, you should try and do some research about what you're describing and what they would have called it at the time. I've seen some horrific things in the gaming world, and LARPers who try and make up a persona and really just miss the idea of what people did and what these trade names meant. Anyway, I think this is sort of at least a 10,000-foot overview of some of the old trades and what they meant. Bye.